He stood in the doorway and said nothing. The room behind him was unchanged. The same walls, the same bunks, the same men sitting where they always sat. But something inside him had shifted. Something he couldn't name yet. Something that would determine whether he survived the next 3 years or broke under the weight of them. June 1943, Stalag Luft 3, Sagan, Germany. The man was a British pilot, 24 years old, shot down over the Ruhr 2 weeks earlier. His Lancaster had gone down in flames, and he'd bailed out with burns on his hands and a ringing in his ears that hadn't stopped. The interrogation had been brief. The transfer to the camp had been cold and silent. And now he was here, standing at the threshold of a hut filled with other prisoners, trying to decide what kind of man he was going to be. He didn't know it yet, but the decision he was about to make would define everything that followed. Not a grand decision, not a moment of heroism or defiance. Just a small choice about how to spend his time, whether to retreat inward or step forward, whether to wait or to act, whether to survive passively or to survive with purpose. The war had taught him how to fly. The camp was about to teach him something harder. And then, the thing about captivity is that it arrives suddenly but unfolds slowly. One moment you're in a cockpit at 20,000 feet, executing maneuvers you've practiced 1,000 times, connected to your crew by intercom static and shared purpose. The next moment you're falling through smoke and wind, pulling a ripcord, watching your aircraft spiral away in flames. And then you're on the ground surrounded by people who speak a language you barely understand, and everything you were has been stripped away in the span of minutes. The transition is violent, but what comes after is worse, because after the violence comes the waiting. Prisoner of war camps are often imagined as places of waiting, men sitting in limbo, counting days, enduring boredom and deprivation until liberation or defeat releases them. There is truth in that image. Waiting was a constant. The days were long and shapeless. The future was uncertain. Control had been stripped away. But what that image misses is the interior war that every prisoner fought, the question that surfaced every morning and required an answer. What do you do when there is nothing to do? How do you remain yourself when the structures that defined you have been removed? The British Officer Corps had been trained for combat, leadership, decision-making under pressure. They had been taught navigation, tactics, aircraft systems, crew coordination. They had been drilled on procedures for every conceivable emergency: engine failure, hydraulic loss, fire, enemy contact. But they had not been trained for captivity. There was no manual for this, no doctrine, no set of procedures that explained how to maintain your identity when your role no longer existed. The men who arrived at Stalag Luft 3 in 1943 were pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, educated, disciplined, used to purpose and structure. They came from universities, from grammar schools, from families that valued order and achievement, and now they were confined to a compound of wooden huts surrounded by double wire fences, with guard towers at each corner and nothing to do except exist. Some men collapsed inward almost immediately. They stopped shaving, stopped exercising, stopped talking except when necessary. They lay on their bunks and stared at the ceiling and let the days pass through them like water. It wasn't weakness, not in a simple sense. It was a kind of surrender to the reality of their situation, a recognition that nothing they did mattered anymore. The war would be won or lost without them. Their agency had ended the moment they were captured. Why pretend otherwise? Why exhaust yourself maintaining routines that served no purpose only? The logic was sound in its way, but the men who followed that logic tended to deteriorate. Not all at once. Gradually, their posture changed, their eyes went distant. They stopped asking questions. They became spectators in their own lives, watching the days accumulate without participating in them. Other men chose differently. They organized themselves. They created structure where none existed. They formed committees, assigned roles, invented routines that mimicked military order. They held classes on mathematics, languages, history, engineering. They built theaters out of scavenged wood and stolen nails. They dug tunnels with tools fashioned from bed frames and tin cans. They turned captivity into a kind of parallel existence, a shadow military where rank still mattered and purpose could still be manufactured. It wasn't freedom. It was the performance of freedom. But the performance mattered. It kept them intact. The pilot standing in the doorway had to choose which kind of man he would become. He had been raised to believe in duty and discipline. His father had served in the previous war and rarely spoke about it, but the lessons were clear. You did your job. You didn't complain. You maintained standards even when circumstances made them difficult. His training had emphasized the same values: control, precision, the importance of maintaining form even under stress. Flying was about checklists and procedures, about doing things correctly even when the aircraft was on fire and the altimeter was unwinding and every instinct screamed at you to panic. But he had also seen what happened to men who clung too tightly to structure when the structure no longer held. And, he had watched officers crack during training, men who couldn't adapt when procedures failed, who needed the world to behave predictably and fell apart when it didn't. Rigidity, he understood, was its own kind of weakness. He understood instinctively that survival here would require something different. Not rigidity, not passivity, something in between, something flexible enough to bend without breaking, but firm enough to provide shape. He stepped into the room. A man near the window glanced up. Older, perhaps 30, with graying hair at the temples and the bearing of someone who had been here longer. Lines around his eyes, a steadiness in his posture that suggested he'd found his equilibrium. He didn't smile, but there was recognition in his eyes. The look of someone who had seen new arrivals before and knew what they were going through. "You're the Lancaster pilot," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. How are the hands?" The pilot glanced down at his bandaged palm. He gestured to an empty bunk in the corner, away from the stove but near a window. "That one's yours. We share everything here. Food, news, duties. Red Cross parcels get divided equally. If you've got skills, we'll use them. If you don't, you'll learn. There's a roster on the wall by the door. You'll be assigned something by tomorrow. Kitchen duty probably to start. Everyone starts there." The pilot nodded. He sat down on the bunk and let his hands rest in his lap. The burns were bandaged, but they still throbbed with a deep, persistent ache. He wondered if they would scar. He wondered if it mattered. The older man was still watching him. "There are two kinds of people in this camp," he said quietly. "The ones who wait and the ones who work. You'll have to decide which you are. No one can decide for you." The pilot didn't respond. He didn't need to. The man had already turned back to whatever he'd been doing before. A book with a cracked spine open on his lap, but the words stayed with him. They felt true in a way that instructions and orders never quite did. This wasn't about following commands. This was about choosing a posture toward time itself. The decision came gradually, over days rather than moments. He noticed that the men who worked seemed steadier. They moved with purpose. They had routines that structured their days. They woke at the same time. They exercised in the compound yard. They attended classes. They took on responsibilities, small ones mostly, but enough to create a sense of forward movement. They spoke to each other with a kind of shorthand that came from shared tasks, a language of collaboration that implied they were building something together. The men who waited, by contrast, seemed hollow. Their conversations were shallow and repetitive. They talked about the past, about flights they'd flown and women they'd known and meals they'd eaten. Or they talked about the future, about what they'd do when they got home, the jobs they'd take, the places they'd visit. But they never talked about the present. They existed in a state of suspension, neither here nor there. And the suspension was eating them from the inside. The pilot began attending the classes that were held in the evenings after the final roll call. Mathematics taught by a former schoolteacher from Manchester, a navigator who had been shot down in 1941 and had been here ever since. He taught calculus and geometry on a makeshift blackboard made from painted wood, using chalk fashioned from crushed brick and water. The classes were informal, crowded, sometimes interrupted by inspections or sudden roll calls. But they were real. The teacher took them seriously, and the men who attended absorbed the material with a focus that would have surprised their instructors back home. History taught by a Cambridge graduate, a pilot who had studied medieval literature before the war. He lectured on the Norman conquest, the Wars of the Roses, the rise and fall of empires. He had no books except the ones he carried in his memory, so he recited facts and dates and encouraged discussion. The men argued about causes and effects, about whether history was driven by individuals or forces, about what the past could teach them about the present. German language lessons taught by a man who had lived in Berlin before the war, working for a shipping company. He had a native fluency and a passion for grammar. He drilled them on declensions and verb conjugations, made them practice conversations, corrected their pronunciation with meticulous care. Some men attended because they thought it might be useful for escape attempts. Others attended because it gave them something to master, a skill that could still grow even when everything else had stopped. The pilot discovered that he was good at languages. German came easily to him, the grammar logical, the pronunciation satisfying. He began listening to the guards when they spoke to each other, picking up phrases, testing them quietly in his head. It was a small skill, almost useless in practical terms, but it gave him something to focus on, a progression he could measure. Each new word learned felt like a tiny victory. Learning became a form of resistance, not against the Germans who barely cared what the prisoners did with their time as long as they caused no trouble, but against the erosion of self that captivity imposed. To study was to assert that the mind still mattered. That intellect could not be imprisoned. That growth was still possible even when physical movement was not. Then there was the theater. Someone, a flight lieutenant with a background in amateur dramatics, had the idea to stage a play. It was absurd on the surface. They had no costumes, no real stage, no lighting equipment, no professional actors, but they had time, and they had ingenuity, and they had a deep need to create something that wasn't about survival. The play was a comedy, light and trivial, something by Noel Coward about drawing room misunderstandings and mistaken identities. The kind of thing that would have been forgotten immediately in peacetime. In the camp, it became an event. The pilot volunteered to help with construction. He had no experience with carpentry, but he learned. They built a stage from scavenged wood, planks salvaged from broken bunks and stolen from supply sheds. They rigged lights from smuggled wire and bulbs traded from guards. They sewed costumes from blankets and stolen fabric, dyed with solutions made from crushed berries and brick dust. The work was painstaking and slow, and it didn't matter. The process was the point. Rehearsals became a focal point. Men gathered in the evenings to watch, to laugh at mistakes, to offer suggestions. The actors took it seriously, memorizing lines, working on timing, developing characters. It was play, yes, but it was also craft. It was the application of skill and discipline to something that served no practical purpose except beauty and distraction. On the night of the performance, the hut was packed. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, crammed into every available space, sitting on bunks and leaning against walls. The air was thick with body heat and anticipation. The play itself was clumsy at first, the actors nervous, the timing off. But then the first laugh came, genuine and unforced, and something shifted in the room. The actors relaxed. Their performances sharpened. The audience leaned forward, fully engaged. For 2 hours, they were not prisoners. They were an audience. They were participants in something that existed beyond the wire, beyond the war, beyond the circumstances that had brought them here. The pilot sat in the back and watched the faces around him. He saw men who had been hollow a month earlier now laughing, leaning forward, fully present. He saw the actors on stage feeding off the energy, their performances improving moment by moment. He saw the creation of a shared experience, something that would be remembered not because it was grand, but because it was theirs. This was what purpose looked like when traditional purpose had been stripped away. It wasn't about accomplishing something that mattered in the larger world. It was about creating meaning in a place designed to deny it. But there was a darker side to this structure, a cost that wasn't always visible to those who benefited from it. The men who organized the camp's activities were extraordinarily capable. They had to be. They were managing education, entertainment, morale, discipline, intelligence gathering, and escape operations, all while under constant surveillance by guards who were looking for any excuse to crack down. They created entire systems from nothing. Committees for food distribution, for mail sorting, for medical care, for discipline and dispute resolution. It was impressive. It was necessary. It was also exhausting. The pilot began to notice the toll it took. The men who carried the most responsibility aged faster. They slept less. Their faces developed lines that hadn't been there months before. They snapped at small frustrations. Their patience worn thin by the constant demands. They carried the weight of keeping everyone else intact, and that weight was relentless. There was no break from it. No rotation, no relief. If you were capable, you were needed, and the need never stopped. One of the senior officers, a squadron leader who had been at the camp since 1941, collapsed during a morning roll call. He simply stopped standing and sat down in the dirt. The guards shouted at him in German, ordering him to stand. The other prisoners helped him to his feet, supporting him under the arms. He was fine physically, no illness, no injury. But something inside him had given out. The spring had unwound. He was taken to the camp infirmary and stayed there for 3 days, not because he was sick, but because he needed to stop. He needed permission to rest, and the only way to get that permission was to break. The pilot understood then that purpose was not a pure good. It sustained, but it also demanded. The men who waited did nothing and withered slowly. The men who worked did everything and burned bright and fast. There was no perfect answer, only choices, each with consequences that had to be managed. He found his own rhythm, his own calibration between engagement and withdrawal. He attended classes. He helped with construction projects when they arose. He learned German and practiced it with other prisoners who were further along. He did not volunteer for escape committees or tunnel digging. That wasn't cowardice. It was calculation. He knew his limits. He knew he didn't have the temperament for the intensity of escape work, the secrecy, the constant alertness, the risk of severe punishment if caught. He respected the men who did that work, admired them even, but he wasn't one of them. Instead, he became a kind of informal translator, not officially, not as an assigned role. No, but when disputes arose between prisoners and guards, when orders needed to be clarified, when small negotiations needed to happen over supplies or privileges, he was often the one who stepped forward. His German was good enough. His manner was calm. He could smooth over tensions without escalating them, could find the words that allowed both sides to save face. It was a small role, but it was his. And that, he realized, was enough. The weeks became months. The months became a year. The routines that had once felt artificial became genuine, woven into the fabric of daily life. The classes continued. New subjects were added. The theater group staged more plays, each one more ambitious than the last. The tunnel diggers kept digging, though most of their tunnels were discovered before completion. One Tom was found in September. Another Dick was abandoned, but Harry continued slowly, invisibly, a project of hope that required relentless discipline. Life in the camp developed its own texture, its own seasons, its own internal logic. Winter was hardest, the cold seeping through the walls, the stove never quite adequate. Spring brought relief, the ability to spend time outside without freezing. Summer was almost pleasant, if you could forget where you were. Autumn brought anxiety, the knowledge that another winter was coming. The pilot changed in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He became quieter, more patient, less concerned with the future, and more focused on the day in front of him. He stopped thinking about what he would do after the war and started thinking about what he would do that afternoon. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. It was the difference between waiting for life to resume and living the life he had. He also became aware of something else, something that took months to fully understand. The men who survived captivity best, who maintained their sanity and their sense of self, were not the toughest or the most defiant. They were the most adaptable, the ones who could find meaning in small things, the ones who could build routines without becoming enslaved to them, the ones who could balance purpose and rest, engagement and withdrawal, connection and solitude. Survival wasn't about endurance alone. It was about calibration, about finding the sustainable middle between extremes. The war, of course, continued without them. News filtered in through smuggled radios hidden in the camp, through coded letters from home, through new prisoners who brought reports of what was happening outside. The Allies were advancing, slowly at first, then faster. North Africa, Sicily, Italy. The bombing campaign over Germany intensified. Cities were being destroyed. The Red Army was pushing from the east. The Germans were retreating on multiple fronts. The prisoners tracked the progress obsessively, mapping advances on hand-drawn charts, debating strategies, arguing over timelines. The war had moved on without them, but they followed it with the intensity of people whose lives depended on its outcome. Which they did. Liberation would come only with Allied victory. Until then, they were stuck, but they also knew that none of this changed their immediate reality. They were still behind wire. They were still powerless. The end would come when it came, and nothing they did would hasten or delay it. So they continued their routines. They attended classes, they staged plays, they dug tunnels, they lived. In March 1944, the Great Escape happened. 76 men crawled through Tunnel Harry and made it out of the camp. Most were recaptured within days. 50 were executed on Hitler's orders, murdered in cold blood as a deterrent. The camp went into shock. The theater closed. Classes stopped. The mood turned dark and stayed that way for months. The pilot had not been part of the escape. He had known about it, everyone did, but he had not been selected. He felt guilt about that, survivor's guilt, even though he had never volunteered. The men who died had been friends, acquaintances, fellow prisoners. Their absence was a wound, but life continued because it had to. The classes resumed, quietly at first. The theater reopened. New plays were staged. The routines rebuilt themselves because the alternative was collapse, and collapse was unacceptable. In early 1945, the camp was evacuated. The Soviet advance was closing in from the east, and the Germans didn't want the prisoners liberated by the Red Army. The march west began in January, in the middle of winter. Thousands of prisoners forced to walk through snow and ice with inadequate clothing and almost no food. The guards were nervous, uncertain, following orders that no longer made sense. The march was brutal. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Some died from exposure. The pilot walked, one foot in front of the other. His boots worn through, his hands numb. He didn't think about the distance ahead. He thought about the next step, and then the next. The calibration that had sustained him in the camp sustained him now. Don't look too far ahead. Stay in the present. Keep moving. When liberation finally came, it was anticlimactic. American troops in jeeps appearing on a country road somewhere in Bavaria, waving them forward. No drama, no speeches, just the quiet realization that it was over. They were free. They could stop walking. The pilot returned to England in the spring of 1945. He was 27 years old. He had been a prisoner for nearly 2 years. The world he returned to was different from the one he'd left. His family was older. His mother cried when she saw him. His father shook his hand and said nothing, which was his way. His friends had moved on, married, taken jobs, started lives. The war was ending, but the peace felt strange and uncertain. He didn't talk much about the camp. People asked occasionally out of politeness or curiosity, and he gave brief answers. It was fine. He survived. He was one of the lucky ones, the standard response, but he didn't explain what it had really been like. The slow interior battle, the daily calibration between purpose and rest, the discovery that meaning could be constructed from almost nothing if you were willing to try. He went back to work. He flew again, though not in combat. He married. He had children. He built a life that looked from the outside like many other lives. But the lessons from the camp stayed with him, invisibly shaping how he approached problems, how he spent his time, how he thought about purpose and agency. Years later, decades later, someone asked him what he had learned in the camp. He was an old man by then, retired, sitting in a garden on a summer afternoon. He thought for a long time before answering. I learned that you can wait for your life to start, he said slowly, or you can start it with what you have, right now, with whatever's in front of you. It wasn't profound, it wasn't poetic, but it was true and it was his. The small decision he had made in June 1943 to step into that room instead of retreating into himself had determined the shape of the years that followed, not because it was heroic, not because it changed the course of the war, but because it changed him. It taught him that agency existed even in captivity. That purpose could be constructed even when imposed purpose had been stripped away, that the most important choice was often simply how you spent your time. The lesson stayed with him for the rest of his life. Not as a grand revelation, just as a quiet understanding that the most important battles are often fought in silence against invisible enemies, and that victory looks less like triumph and more like simply remaining intact. Remaining yourself when everything around you is designed to break you down. World War II is remembered for its grand strategies, its epic battles, its turning points, and decisive moments. D-Day, Stalingrad, Midway. The names carry weight, signifying moments when the course of history pivoted. But for millions of men and women, the war was not experienced at that scale. It was experienced in small rooms and long waits, in decisions about how to spend an afternoon, In the choice between lying on a bunk or attending a class, between withdrawal and engagement, those choices don't appear in the history books. They don't shape the maps or determine the strategic outcomes, but they shaped the people who made them, and in that sense, they matter just as much as any battle. Perhaps more, because they determined whether those people emerged from the war intact or broken, whether they carried forward something valuable or only trauma and loss. The pilot's decision to step forward instead of retreating inward was one of millions of such decisions made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. None of them individually changed the war, but collectively, they determined what kind of peace would follow. Because the people who made those choices, who found ways to maintain their humanity under conditions designed to strip it away, were the ones who rebuilt the world afterward. So perhaps the question worth asking is not what the big moments teach us, but what the small ones do. Not how people behaved in the grand crises, but how they behaved in the long waits. Not what they did when the stakes were clear and dramatic, but what they did when nothing seemed to matter and no one was watching, because that, ultimately, is where character is formed and revealed. Transformed and revealed. Not in the moments of obvious heroism, but in the accumulation of small choices, made day after day, when no one is keeping score and nothing seems to depend on them, except everything does. This video is based on historical records, expert analysis, and documented sources. Some interpretations are simplified for storytelling clarity.